see all of you from across the country. We have Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, BLM. We've got so many different people from across the country, federal agencies, nonprofits. It's really exciting to see all of you today. And I know that this is a tough time for everyone, and our webinar today is centering equity in EE's COVID response. And we know from doing these webinars that everybody is anxious to talk to each other, even though Zoom can get wearing. It's great to see people, learn new things, talk to each other, but we also know that it is a really tough time. And I know it's especially a tough time in our field. We have heard from so many of our colleagues who have lost their jobs, they're laid off, they're in furlough. And I just want to thank all of you for all that you're doing. The ones that are still working are trying to help everybody that isn't working and help society and help us move through this. And you're juggling families and kids and everything else. So thank you for joining. We know it's hard. And I also just want to say that this topic of equity and inclusion couldn't be more important, and it couldn't be more important than now. We have had so many examples of inequities and systemic racism just in the past few weeks, and it's making us all think about what we should be and could be doing as a society. We've also seen how nature has become this one common source of joy. People are birding, they're learning, they're finding out about the world around them. But we also know that equitable and safe access to nature is not a given for so many. And we've also seen students and adults who don't have equitable access to the internet, and we're seeing the impact of the virus on the poor and on people of color. So it couldn't be more important. And I am so excited that we have Angela Park with us today to help us talk through this, think through this, and think about what we can do. And I'll introduce her in just a minute, but just a few intro comments. As many of you know that have been on our webinars, we've been trying to do about a webinar a week to try and bring new insights and ideas during the crisis and also beyond. We're talking about a lot of different topics throughout the weeks. I want to thank our affiliate co-hosts for all that they are doing during this crisis and beyond, who are helping across the country to help engage people in environmental education. Really excited to have you on board and be partners. And we also know that everybody is using different platforms for all of these virtual calls. We use Zoom. It's very easy, but just know again that you are all muted and you can't see anyone but us panelists up here, but you can communicate with us if you go to the chat function, and you can see you can either send a message to the three of us or you can send a message to everyone. And if you have a comment or you have resources, we really hope you'll enter it into the chat, as well as questions for Angela, and she'll try and answer as many as she can. Whoops. And one of the things we are always looking for are resources that you are going to bring or ideas that you have, but everybody will get a copy of the recording, a PDF of the PowerPoint, and comments in the chat, because a lot of the resources that you put in the chat are really interesting and important. And Angela has agreed to stay an extra 15 minutes to answer questions if we don't get to all of them. So thank you, Angela, for doing that. And one last couple of things, that we are going to do a captioning of the recording that goes out to everybody, so that those of you who have trouble with audio will be able to see the captions. And I also want to give a big thank you to Anne Umali, who's our webinar guru, and she is the director of our professional development work at NAAE, and she is the head of EE360. So Anne, thank you so much for all you do. And now it gives me great pleasure. I am so excited to be able to introduce Angela Park, and I have to get my papers out here because there's so much I could say about Angela that we'd be here all day. Many of you know Angela, since she's been one of the leading voices in talking about how to create a more equitable and inclusive environmental education movement. She's a writer, she's an independent consultant, she's a researcher, and she has been such a wonderful mentor and trainer to so many of us. She is dedicated to making social justice and equity hallmarks of progressive institutions. She works with so many different kinds of groups, from nonprofits like us to foundations, to coalitions, government agencies, companies, and more. And I have been so lucky to have had a chance to work with Angela and learn from her over the years, from her work with Together Green, where we trained a lot of fellows, and she has been fantastic And she's also been a keynote speaker and workshop leader for many NAAE and Audubon initiatives. She brings 3 decades of experience on sustainable development policy, environmental justice, equity and diversity, and organizational and leadership development to the work we all do. Much of her work focuses on the integration of social, environmental, and economic issues, and she is a leading expert on diversity in the environmental field, combining a unique high-level policy background and organizational development expertise to her consulting and writing. As you can see, she's done a lot, she's written a lot, she's worked in a lot of different places. She was named a Young Woman of Achievement by the Women's Information Network. She's been on the board of many organizations, and she's been an advisor to so many of us. She's a sought-after speaker, facilitator, trainer, and teacher, and we are so, so lucky to have her with us today. So Angela, take it away, and thank you again for being with us today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Judy. I'm so glad to be here with all of you. I had to take myself off video because I can't keep a straight face when I'm listening to Judy give intros. So I'm gonna share a couple of slides. And while I'm doing the slides, I'm actually not gonna be on video, but then once we're done with the slides, I'll come back. And then hopefully we'll have an opportunity to have some engagement. I'm not gonna do like a big long presentation today. There are a couple things I just wanted to tee up as a starting point for this conversation. And then I'm hoping that most of the time that we have today is you all having an opportunity to share, what have you been doing to center equity in your work as you respond to COVID? What are some lessons learned that you'd like to share with other people? And then obviously time for people to ask questions and to engage. And to be clear, I have some expertise in these issues, but I'm not, really in the weeds of a lot of the direct program engagement work that you all do. So I don't know a lot about internet access and things like that, but I certainly can help you think about these issues. And so we're gonna start by framing up a little bit of context. So let me see here. Let's see. Oh, it's supposed to be starting at the beginning. Okay, so a couple things around context that I wanted to flag for you all. I want you to be thinking first and foremost about what does it mean? What does it mean to center equity? And people who know me know that I am a real stickler for language. So I would love to hear your thoughts about what does it mean to center equity. And so let's just take a moment, and if you all could type ideas in the chat, and Anne and Judy are going to kind of share aloud what you think. But let's start right there.
So Angela, we've got things like everyone is represented, everyone on a level playing field. They're going by really quickly. Always considering who's left out.
Mm-hmm.
Centered in justice, accessibility, everybody matters. Elevating voices aren't there. Making sure we don't perpetuate injustice. Just so many great ideas here. Support those who have historically been marginalized, evaluating our own biases, considering what different audiences need to succeed, evaluating business practices around justice, marginalized populations, giving support where needed to ensure access, sharing authority. Those with privilege knowing to stand side by side versus the front. Knowing equity doesn't mean treating everyone the same. And writing new policies through an equity lens. We have a lot more coming in, sharing power with participants, making sure our staff and board members reflect the communities we work in. rather than drawing equity for centering on diversity and inclusion, making equity the start and foundational focus. Asking communities what they need and want, and then genuinely responding to that.
Okay, so that is a great start. And I would encourage you, to continue to add thoughts in the chat. And the reason why I'm asking you to do that is because I want you to own this topic and to start by what you have been thinking about and the roles that you all have been playing with these two words around centering equity. And the thing I would really encourage you all to be thinking about, and the reason why you're on this call, is because this is about your leadership in embedding justice and equity throughout not only environmental education, but in the organizations and coalitions and many other networks that you're a part of. And one of the critically important parts of leadership is being able to communicate what the it is. And so, people who have worked with me know that if you're going to work with me, I'm not going to let you hide behind an acronym. I don't believe in using DEI or ED&I and JEDI. Like, to me, you've got to actually use words and have your own clear definitions. And so to be able to center equity in this work, you need to think about what does that mean and how do you communicate that to people? Because no matter, what groups you're involved in, if you say, we really need to center equity in our COVID response, a lot of people are going to say, I don't know what you mean by that. Or they may nod their head and pretend they know what they mean when they actually don't. So what we're going to dig into a little bit about is, what exactly does it mean to center equity, and how do we articulate that without using jargon? So a couple things toward that. I know many of you have seen this slide, and this is a slide that is fundamentally about a couple of things. One, what is the universal goal that we're trying to achieve as a society? And by group identity, what do we know about the differences in access and opportunity to that universal goal? So in your field, I would say one of your universal goals as environmental educators is to ensure that everyone has access to environmental education that is relevant to them, that is engaging to them, that enriches their lives. And the question that this slide is asking is, who by group identity already has that access and actually doesn't need more because they've already got it? And who by group identity does not have that access, and who do you need to then center? So one way of thinking about this is a little bit more broadly. Equity and justice are about what are the outcomes of our actions. What are the outcomes, the manifestations of the results that we create out in the world via the programs that we offer, via the ways we engage with other people, based on the decisions that we make? And are the impacts of all of our cumulative actions, big and little, are they fair, or are they actually disproportionate based on group identity? So when I say group identity, I'm talking about the thing that we're really digging into when we use the word diversity. And whenever I define diversity, I always, give a definition, but I also always frame diversity as a question. Diversity and group identity are fundamentally about equity for whom? So when we're talking about justice and equity, we use the word all, and we use the word kind of universal frequently, but to actually act in the world to create a more just and equitable world, you actually have to get away from the all and start focusing on the actual differences. So to not pay attention to group identity is to actually ensure that whatever injustice has already been embedded in structures and systems are perpetuated. So by group identity, to be specific, I'm talking about different kinds of diversity, different kinds of group identity that shape our experiences in the world. Group identity shapes not only who we are and how others perceive us, but also how we experience the world. And so when you think about what it means to center equity, to drill down a little bit more specifically, you have to think about what exactly are we talking about? And there's a question underneath that surface. And that question is, by group identity, who is being disproportionately impacted by COVID, by this pandemic, by this crisis? So when you think about who we're actually talking about by group identity, who is the disproportionately impacted group, who would you say are the folks that you've noticed in your work or in your programming, or even in simply tracking the news? Who by group identity, who are we talking about when we talk about the people who need to be centered? So if you could write into the chat some of your ideas, I'd love to have you dig into this level, this question at a level of specificity. And if you have thought about why, I'd love to hear a little bit about your thoughts about why are certain groups being disproportionately impacted. So let's hear a little bit about that.
So Angela, we're seeing, if you aren't looking, low income students, seniors, people of color, indigenous populations, Hispanic and Latino, people of color comes up a lot. Those who suffer from mental illness, lower income people, people of color communities are impacted, single parents, those who live with poor air quality, the elderly, essential business workers, those without technology, introverts, parents in general, worker class, people in close quarters like high-rise apartments, inner city, folks in rural areas, people of color because healthcare institutions were biased against them even before the pandemic. Marginalized communities, people with disabilities, young children that have less access to their basic needs, women, the uneducated, systemic and institutional racism, why, common thread economics, why, critically ill, non-English speakers.
So that's a great start. And what I want to do is I want to go back to this last slide and dig in a little bit on a couple of the things that you all are mentioning. So one of the reasons why I'm asking you to get really specific is because we oftentimes, in trying to center equity, we oftentimes are unclear about how to communicate and talk about these issues. And it is my belief that if you're not specific, you actually can't make an impact. And so this conversation about who exactly are we talking about, and I think all of the things that you all have named are 100% true. And so in answering this conversation, this question about, what does it mean to center equity, you have to answer the question about who is the who. And so a lot of those examples that you all gave are true for society. And I think some of them are particularly relevant for the work that you all are doing right now as environmental educators. Clearly, you're in a context in which you cannot do in-person environmental education projects. And so the translation to what that means is having a significant impact on the participants in all of your programs. And to just be specific, let's just take race, because it is such an obvious one. When you think about the impact of COVID in indigenous communities and the Navajo Nation very specifically, for example, when you think about the extreme disproportionate impact when it comes to deaths of African Americans and Latinx communities, when we name that disparity, we have to dig into the why. And you all have already, even just via the chat, begun to explore this. The why for this disproportionate impact has everything to do with what we have structured into our healthcare system, into our transportation systems, into the ways in which our economy is structured and our health insurance is structured. So some of what we're going to dig into a little bit is, what does it mean to kind of better understand all of these impacts? So here are a couple things that I always frame up when I am talking with organizations about what it means to be intentional about justice and equity. And these are a couple things. One is once you've answered that question about who is most impacted by an issue, you have to figure out how do you put them at the forefront of your work? How do you make sure that they have an opportunity to have input and to shape the decisions and the policies that you're going to be making? So if you don't answer the question of who is most impacted, then it's impossible to then be intentional about their engagement. So part of what I was encouraging you to think about is when you think about your programs, how to get very specific about who's being most impacted, so that then those are the people that you either have to accommodate, you have to engage, you have to really consider when it comes to the impacts of the decisions that you make. Another thing that's really important, and this is obvious, but I'm going to name it explicitly, is if you do not track group identity, you cannot figure out whether you're having a disproportionate impact. So some of you know that there have been some arguments at the national level among elected officials about whether race should even be tracked in COVID deaths. And it would be very convenient to not even notice whether it's 10,000 white people dying, or 10,000 African Americans dying, or 10,000 people who identify as Latinx dying. The reason why we have to push for that kind of tracking is because it is the only way to know that the disproportionate impact is actually taking place. And to give you a more, day-to-day example, if you're in a meeting and, there are a bunch of people talking in the meeting and there are a bunch of people who are not talking in the meeting, if you are bringing an equity analysis to who is talking, one of the things you ask is, gee, I've noticed that like every single man has talked at least twice, but none of the women have spoken for more than 30 seconds each. And so when we track by gender, the amount of airtime people are having in this meeting, it definitely doesn't match the demographics of the group, but also what does that say about, what's happening here? So you have to track group identity in order to be able to even know whether there's any kind of disproportionate impact. And then this is the piece that we've been starting to dig into. And some of you were able to really quickly off the top of your heads kind of name this in the chat, is the reason for unjust and inequitable outcomes is not based on individual level behavior. When you look at these broad patterns of disproportionate impact, it's not about what someone is actually doing themselves. It's about a much bigger structure. And so when you think specifically about our healthcare system, there have been countless analyses and studies of the ways in which race affects the quality of the healthcare that you receive. It affects the level of pain medication. This is highly disturbing that they have done significant research into how much pain medication white patients are given when they complain of a certain kind of pain compared to what people who identify as Black are being prescribed. Black people do not get the same level of response. They don't get the same quality of pain management as white people do. And so this is not interpersonal behavior alone. This is about what's been structured. So when you think about access to the internet, for example, there are places in the world where that's considered an essential utility, just like running water and electricity are. But we live in a country in which there's a system of doling out internet access and quality of internet access. So it's 100% based on capitalism, which is similar to what we do with healthcare. So as you're trying to think about how to engage people across distance, obviously that is a major part of what you're bumping up against. So just a couple things before we open it up. The thing I want you to be thinking about is when we talk about centering equity, we're talking about the fact that in order to work for any kind of just outcomes, the focus, and this is what I was trying to flag with that slide, is that you really have to target your efforts and center the people who are situated furthest away currently from access to that universal good. And so there are I know that you all know because you've been digging into this for so many years, there are obviously key, important patterns around access to environmental education. And without focusing with a level of specificity on the people who are most impacted not being able to have that access and opportunity, to not focus on them is to not actually center equity. So this is just another thing I want to flag for those of you who are, I think it's hard sometimes to think about what structural racism is, what structural classism is. And when I was saying this is not about individual behavior, what I'm talking about is the fact that this kind of structural inequality is based on what we embed in our institutional policies and practices, in addition to what lives across institutions and society. And the reason why structural inequality is so challenging to dismantle is because it is so complex. It is so multifaceted, it is cumulative, and all of these factors, compound on one another. And this is about really systemic privileging of white people over people of color, systemic privileging of men over women. It's systemic privileging of people who have white collar jobs versus the people who have jobs that they physically have to go to. And so I think a lot of these structural inequalities are coming to light in really visceral ways as we think about this crisis. I also want to, I really appreciated what Judy said at the beginning of this webinar about acknowledging how much pain and trauma is being experienced right now in this country and in the entire world right now. And it's not just suffering from COVID. It is also a level of suffering and trauma that's being experienced by Black communities, by Indigenous communities, by the continuation of how structural inequality is affecting them. And obviously, one of the most important examples is the continued killing, the state-sanctioned killing of Black men. It is not a simple thing to fix these issues. And at the same time, it is so important for all of us who work in the environmental field to realize that police brutality and state-sanctioned killing of Black people in this country is actually an environmental issue. I think one of the biggest challenges that we've had in engaging environmentalists in these conversations over many decades has been this resistance to acknowledging that these are interwoven issues. So to not be able to sit in a beautiful part of Central Park and not run the risk of someone calling the police on you because you ask for a simple, abiding of communal rules, or the inability to exercise outdoors, or the inability to really even walk down the street, there is not only an incredibly important structural embedding of all that has, resulted in that outcome. But the thing I want you to be thinking about is just because these isms are structural doesn't mean we can't act on them. It doesn't mean that we can't play a role. It doesn't mean that we can't show up. It doesn't mean that we can't advocate. It doesn't mean that we can't push in a whole bunch of ways. And I'm quite certain you all are aware of a lot of these online articles that have been distributed about what it means to really start to try to address these issues. I can send a couple of links in case you haven't already distributed them. But it's something I want to both emphasize how challenging structural inequality is, but I also want to be really clear that there are lots of structures that have been dismantled over time. And we have the capacity to make these significant shifts. Okay, so this is what I was trying to say by flagging this slide. And typically when I talk about what it means to center equity in your work, these are a couple things that I flag, and I think these are particularly important for the decisions that you're having to make right now when it comes to your reactions to COVID. So you have to ask as an institution, when we look at our policies and practices, and even when we think about the impact of the organizational culture that we've created, is it actually equitable? Do we know, and do we analyze, and do we assess to make sure that how we do onboarding, how we do performance reviews, how we decide who gets promoted, when we think about the culture that we are either very intentional about trying to create and shape, or that we just kind of let continue to evolve in kind of ungoverned ways, what's the impact by group identity on all of those? Is it a situation in which you feel like, across group identity, whether it's race, gender, class, people, experience the organization and its policies and practices in a way that is pretty consistent, or is it really disproportionate? And I can give you one very specific example, which is the work I've done with some organizations to do salary analyses and to make adjustments, when they look at, what men make and what women make, and even for the exact same job, that's an example of really doing this kind of analysis. This is a really important question for you all to ask right now as environmental educators in the middle of a pandemic, which is, who do you serve? And, who are you really engaging in achieving your mission? And by group identity, who makes those decisions? And if by group identity, you have a really inconsistent set of people making decisions that actually affect a completely different constituency, what are you structuring in to change that decision making, to make sure that you really are meeting the needs and centering the folks who are oftentimes left out of the work and the mission-driven focus of your organization? And this seems like a harsh question to ask, but I've had a number of conversations with environmental organizations about, by group identity, getting clear about who really benefits from their work. So I've worked for a lot of climate change organizations in the last 3 decades, and my first foray in policy work was on energy efficiency and transportation, which technically we now kind of fits under the whole climate bucket. But when you think about the work of a lot of organizations that have been working on climate for many years, and you think about who has actually benefited from that institution, there are a lot of people who've drawn salaries over many, many years. There are a lot of people who have had an opportunity to be perceived as leaders by serving on their board. There are obviously impacts to the programmatic work, but a lot of times when people really have to dig in and ask who's benefiting from your work, what they get is a list of people with a lot of dominant group identities and very few tangible impacts for some of the communities that suffer most. And this is where I think climate change activists oftentimes focus on the all and the universal, rather than focusing on the next level down of being a lot more specific. So these are a couple things I just wanted to flag. And these are the questions that I'm hoping we can dig into today. And I don't want to make this, like Q&A where you all ask a question and I somehow have the perfect answer. I think there's so much for you all to learn from each other. So I am hoping that there is a way for you all to share your lessons. You have all clearly been grappling with these issues, at least since early March. And I want to make sure that there's space for you all to share your lessons in addition to questions that you may have and ways in which I can be helpful. So these are a couple of things I'd love for you to be thinking about. And it would be particularly useful to have some very concrete examples of how your organization is bringing an equity analysis to decisions that you're making. And one last thing that I want to flag is there is a concept called a choice point. And the idea behind a choice point is it's basically just a point in time in which you have to make a decision. And how thoughtfully you make that decision can have all sorts of consequences. And so the reason why it is so important to really think specifically about what it means to center equity at this time is because you are making a number of really important decisions right now as organizations are challenged by budget cuts and lack of funding and the inability to draw income from the programs that you offer. And so in many ways, it's moments like this when your values truly matter and when it becomes clear what your values really are. So with that, I'm just going to open it up. And I know we've got so many people and it's a little bit challenging to try to have threads of conversations, but it would be great if you all could be thinking about what you all want to add to these, to this conversation. So what are your thoughts about what you've been doing and what questions you have and what lessons that you are learning?
So Angela, do you want to put your video on and I'll read you this question that's really great. We had actually one that came in earlier and then we have this one. It's from Makiba, if I'm pronouncing that right. She works for a climate change philanthropy and she's wondering how to approach resistance from leaders and boards who think issues of equity and injustice are nice to have versus core to the mission. How do you respond to folks who think the issues can be resolved by 1 or 2 training versus embedded? And somebody else asked earlier about with all the cuts that are going on, not only are staff furloughed in the whole environmental ed field, but people are worried that equity and inclusion will go away.
Mhm.
when there's no money. So those two are kind of linked of how do you make this a need to have, not a nice to have, and not cut. Any thoughts?
And the interesting thing with those two questions is I think the answer is the same. And the answer is the best defense you have for folks who are resistant to this work or who truly don't understand, like, how is this tied, is your analysis and the work that you can do with people who are committed to this work to be really clear about the mission-driven rationale for this. And so there are two things I always recommend that organizations do first if they're going to be digging into this work. And I can tell you most organizations don't do them first. They typically do them later, and then they realize, oh crap, we should have done that at the beginning. So there are two things. One is get really clear about your language and framing. Choose your words with intention. So don't use DEI, use JEDI, get really clear about what is the language that is going to be most resonant in this organization to frame what this work is and what these values are. Have that conversation. Make sure you're clear about definitions, because it is very easy to push back against you if you don't know how to answer questions like, well, what do you mean by that? So be prepared for that. And then once you've been thinking about that language and framing and what's most appropriate and resonant for your organization, the most important thing that can drive your work is a really clear mission-driven rationale. And the way a mission-driven rationale gets adopted by an organization is at least one person in the organization starts figuring out how to answer the question, why is this important? How is this essential? And when I say mission-driven rationale, I want you to start with your mission. You know, we're a climate change organization. We're an environmental education organization in this particular neighborhood. Get really clear about who you are as an organization, and then ask, why is this essential work? You know, and there's so many layers to this. So one of the reasons why it might be critically important, you know, from an economic perspective is when you think about the constituency, the market, so to speak, for participants in our environmental education programming, that market is changing dramatically when it comes to race. We're also really clear that we need to do more to, you know, increase access for people across class. If we don't keep up and make sure that we create programming that's relevant, and if we don't ensure that people who have not historically been served by our programs, when they show up, if we don't make sure they have a good experience, they're not coming back. And so there are economic reasons for this. There are basic things about, like, you know, what is our mission and have we ever lived up to it? Have we ever made sure that everyone has access? So there are a whole bunch of really specific questions I would encourage you to dig into, and I'm happy to share some of them if that would be useful. But you got to be clear about your rationale. And if you can communicate the rationale, that's the way. Not everyone's going to agree with you, but if you've done that thinking, it makes you far more poised to be able to engage those resistant people.
That's great, Angela. There are a lot of other questions. I'm going to ask Ann if she has one to ask. You're going to be busy.
Sure, lots of questions here. So you mentioned a lot about communication strategies and how important it is to center your message and be clear about what you're saying. But what about if you're trying to get a message to someone that's in a position of power and you're not in that position of power? So lots of folks are asking about that. Jennifer is asking, what are the best strategies for getting buy-in on centering equity, especially from those in positions of power? And also Kara is asking, you know, how might we be able to structure advisory boards for more meaningful engagement and shared decision-making power? Any advice along those lines?
Okay, so when it comes to managing up with regard to this work and trying to be persuasive and influential, when it comes to recognizing that you may not be at the executive level in your organization and able to make all of these decisions yourselves, I still think it matters, the stuff I said before. Get clear about what you're talking about, know your definitions, have a rationale for what is important. But one of the best, I'm talking about like a strategy here, one of the things that can be really helpful is if you know, a lot of times senior leaders are happy to like put out a statement or, you know, to give lip service to this work. And one of the things that I would do is get really specific about tracking what they say. And then bringing up the fact that, you know what, it's so great that that's what you put in that statement, or that you've been articulating this as a really important value. I think it's so important for us to make sure that we're really consistent with what we're both communicating and how we're living that in practice. And so in order to really do that, here are some of the things that I think we need to be thinking about in order to dig in. So that's one thing, is to just make sure that they're at least aware of the fact that you can't just say stuff, you actually then have to live up to it. I think that's a very legitimate point to make. One of the best strategies is figuring out who are your allies. Who are the people in leadership who actually do care about these issues, and how do you engage them? How do you make the case that this is something really worthy for additional attention and focus? So how do you organize? This is really a lot of organizational equity transformation is about organizing. I know a lot of you are great organizers. So part of it is organizing and figuring out, even if you can't get to people who are directly on the executive team, which would be great to get them to start playing a role, how do you organize amongst yourselves to figure out who can we actually engage and influence, so that then you can get into that broader system of the executive leaders? So that's something I would definitely flag. And, there's some really good books about how to manage up. And I think there are a couple workshops that are really focused on that. I think managing up, as it relates to this issue, is a really great chunk of work to dig into. What was the second question?
The second question was related to if that same advice would relate to your advisory boards, having more shared power there.
Okay, so the first rule I have for all entities that get created is that you have to be really clear about their role. And so don't pretend people have a decision-making role if they don't. And by definition, the word advisory basically says you don't get to make decisions, because the word advisor is one about influence, but it's not about being the decider. So the first thing I would say is, when you create entities, make sure you have the conversation about exactly who makes the ultimate decisions. What exactly is their role? Advice on what? Where is that advice going to go? What's the accountability? So that if people in an advisory group are sharing a particular message, how do you ever circle back with them? And so this issue of transparency, I think, is absolutely essential. And I feel like I'm going to be repeating myself, but people who have decision-making power, do not let that decision-making power go unless you make a really clear case for how there will be better decisions if there is a more inclusive process. So you need to be really clear about, what is your case? How will we actually be making better decisions if we include a broader array of people who get to influence the ultimate decisions? So those are a couple things I would say. I know I saw one thing about, like, what the heck is managing up? So what I mean by managing up is, typically, the concept of management is there are people up here in a hierarchy and they manage down to the people on their teams. The concept of managing up is, how do any of us who do not live at the highest levels of hierarchy, how do we influence and engage the people who by hierarchy are above us in an institution? Like, how do we get strategic about influencing them and engaging them? And that's what I mean by managing up. So sometimes, I'll give you an example. I had a boss once who just didn't have very good communication skills. And so one of the things that I did to manage up was I would do a lot to staff him and to kind of put language in front of him so that when he showed up at some of these meetings, he didn't sound quite so off on some of these issues where sensitivity is really important. And then slowly over time, he realized, gosh, that just sounded so much better than what I was going to say. And so I've been thinking about how to be a little bit more eloquent. And so by managing up in a kind of subtle-ish way, I was able to get him to realize, like, crap, I am not a good communicator and I need to be better at that. So that's a way of thinking about it.
So Angela, we've had a lot of questions coming in. A lot have dealt with, how do we deal with the virtual divide? So that, number one, they're just people who have no access. Number two, the people that have access, how do we know that we're reaching the students and the adults that need the help in the best way virtually? How do we do that? And then there was a question about, we're often talking about urban audience, about the rural audiences who don't have any access, and how do we communicate with them during this time? So it's a lot of how to connect to different people, differently?
Okay, so I'm going to give you the structural answer first, which I know is not the fun answer because that's not the immediate answer. But the structural answer is for everyone who does environmental education to realize that technology access is your problem. So when people advocate for federal or state or municipal policy change, people oftentimes live in their little alley. If it doesn't have environmental education labeled on it, then that's not our issue. Or I will oftentimes hear people say, well, that's fine and important, but that's not our job. You know, just so you know, we're an environmental organization. And so if you're going to think about your impact in the world and your ability to achieve your mission, one of the things you have to do is use this crisis as an opportunity to get leaders in environmental education to realize that, holy crap, technology access is our problem. It is part of our ability to achieve our mission. So that is the structural solution to what you're flagging. For the immediate responses, it is really hard. And I'm hoping that other people here know more than I do, because first of all, it helps just generally to name the problem. So the first thing you have to do is say, what are we able to track? What are we able to notice? You know, do we have zip codes or participants? But like, do we even collect the data to know by certain demographics who's participating in our programs? And if we notice that there's this huge urban or rural divide, you know, what are we going to intentionally do about it? Some of this you don't even have to study because you already know the answer. And so, you know, you don't have the funding to provide internet access grants to every child who isn't able to participate in your environmental education programs. But you do have the ability to ask, you know, how do we get creative about our programming so that we are able to make it more accessible? And are there community groups in certain neighborhoods where we can be trying to partner with them to do some engagement within their neighborhood or within their town? So I think it's really about getting creative and thinking about, you know, partnerships that you may not have considered before with the community organizations that are already connected to those people. I guarantee you, for every under-resourced, you know, neighborhood or town, there has to be some sort of structure of whether it's the local town hall or, you know, the local childcare centers or the community group or the Boys and Girls Club. How do you think differently about your partners in order to access and engage some of those folks? So those are a couple of thoughts that I have. Yeah. But, you know, I don't have the solution for this because it is so systemic.
It's huge. Yeah. You know, one of our affiliates was talking about, because of the internet divide, that students still needed to get their free lunches. So they were handing out assignments, hard copy, instead of using virtual learning, because not everybody had access, to make it more equitable so that everybody picked up their lunches and then they got the assignment. So people are working around some of these issues. But I think if we collectively try and think about this internet access, community by community, maybe we can make some headway.
Well, and to be clear, the solution to every problem is who's most impacted and how do you get them to help you solve the problem.
Yeah.
So that's one of the biggest issues, is those of us who aren't suffering from some of those issues are sitting here in a corner by ourselves trying to figure out how to address issues for them. So how do you build relationships to be able to identify, you know, folks who'd be willing to partner with you to solve those problems that they know so much more concretely?
So linked to the internet question, and this might be something that Stacy just asked and a number of others have asked, that how do we actually engage the audiences virtually? And so this is an education issue, but when we're talking about centering equity, what does that look like when we're all on Zoom or we're doing things virtually? It's a tough one, but any thoughts or any interactions you've had with others?
Well, one thing, like for example, and maybe I should have made this suggestion sooner, you know, depending on how you format Zoom, you can do small groups or you can't. You know, and so there's a way to format Zoom, and there sometimes are limits around number of people and stuff like that. But, you know, as you can imagine, I'm not doing any in-person education and learning. But that said, I'm doing education and learning like multiple times a week, and it's always via Zoom. And the most helpful tool has been small groups. you can break down a group of 150 people and get them at various points, you know, in a 2-hour webinar or learning session to be able to do a check-in, to be able to answer specific questions. You can be really thoughtful about how to group people so that people have some sort of shared affinity or shared kind of role where they can really dig in. Mm-hmm. I've done so many Zoom sessions that have actually been incredibly meaningful. I did a session, it was 3 days in a row, 2 hours each, for Black, Indigenous people of color within an organization. And they had never had the opportunity to convene. We were supposed to be together for 3 whole days, and instead we did 3, 2-hour chunks. But it was huge. People like built relationships. They talked about really hard, personal, really challenging issues, and they were able to do it all on Zoom. So if you facilitate it with care and you think really strategically about who the people are and what some of their preferences are, and if you use small groups judiciously, it can actually be incredibly helpful for the people who obviously do have access.
Thanks, Angela. And a number of people have put into the chat solutions that they've had, which have been fantastic. And again, everybody will get copies of the comments in the chat. Anne, do you want to take the next one? We have a lot of questions.
Sure, there's so many great questions. Angela, Lisa Keith is mentioning that so many of our institutions are struggling financially right now just to survive. And revenue generating programming is dominating the center more than ever. And also Stephen Jackson in Maine is saying that so many state organizations are moving away from this pledge to put diversity as being a priority, and are just reorganizing organizational priorities and resources away from investment in equity work. So, and staff are forced to do this kind of engagement work on their own time. So any advice for folks that are struggling with this within their own organizations?
So I have a couple of thoughts that are not going to be the full answer, but a couple of things I would flag. So one thing that always comes up whenever these economic crises arise, obviously we haven't had a pandemic be the source for a very, very long time. But one question I always ask myself is, who's in your donor base? And so the things I'm going to flag for you are not immediate things, but structurally, one question to ask is, who's in your donor base? If you don't have people of color in your donor base, they're not going to be pushing the organization or giving money to make sure that you center the needs of kids of color. And so one bigger question to ask is, what long-term work do you need to do to cultivate a wider array of donors? Because if I'm a donor to an organization and, I have the privilege of living in a big house in Vermont with 5 acres of gardens, I have in many ways not personally suffered from this pandemic. And one of the ways in which I feel like it's really important for me to give back is to make donations. So I've been donating quite a bit during this pandemic. And if an environmental education group came to me and said, we are working on trying to fund, access for kids of color, or for kids in, poor kids in rural areas or whatever like that. If they came to me and said that, I would be like, sure, I'd be happy to give you that money. So one question to ask is, who's in your donor group who would actually want to support this work? And how do you, make that a bigger priority? Which gets to the other issue, which is, if you are short-sighted, in the long run, you're going to drive the organization into the ground. When you look at demographics, when you look at the expectations that organizations increasingly have to have with regard to how they're showing up in their values. I mean, Franklin Templeton just fired a high-level vice president because the way she behaved in Central Park was so counter to the way they wanted to show up in the world. It tells you everything about how these values are more and more important across institutions. So when it comes to the specifics around, how do you manage this crisis, I don't have the answer for that. I am not a fundraising person, and I don't, I think there are probably folks in this group that know better. But what I would say is, in the long run, you're faced with this choice point now. And some of what is either making the options for the answers that you all are coming up with as institutions, the reason why it's either such a narrow answer or it's a little bit more expansive has a lot to do with that, whether you really made the case previously, to help people understand that like equity is essential to our mission. It's not a thing that, it doesn't live over there. It's in here all the time. And I think that kind of integration and ability to communicate and engage and influence people in your organization is just so essential to your leadership.
So Angela, how about if we take one more, do our closing for those who have to leave, and then we'll do the rest of the questions right after that. Sure. But Narissa has asked a question about something a little not related exactly to environmental education, but a number of students and adults want to go to marches and rallies. So how do we restructure events like marches and rallies without having to incorporate the police for event permits, because the police can escalate these conflicts and pose danger, but you still want to make a point? Any thoughts on that one?
Oh,
I know.
Well, talk about a biggie. So this is something that so many organizations are dealing with, because obviously we're in a federal election year, and a lot of the organizations that I work with have been given massive amounts of funding to mobilize voters and to do electoral work. And doing that in a pandemic is obviously incredibly different. So the first thing I would say is there are a lot of people thinking about this much more than I am. And I think it would be great to find a way to make some connections so people who are really at the front lines having to deal with this can learn from each other. The other thing I would say is, you can, in various communities, do work to engage your police departments. One of those documents I was mentioning that, I hope you've seen, has a list of like 50 things that white people need to be doing to create a more racially just world. And one of the most important things is have these conversations with police departments. Make it clear that there are people in the community that recognize that police presence is not always a good thing. And that, the idea that police brutality always happens somewhere else. Well, it always happens somewhere else because the organizing hasn't happened locally. So I think it's just incredibly important to begin those conversations. Of course, that's a long-term thing. A lot of my answers are structural, sorry. But that I think is a really important thing. But even if you're planning an event now, I think having that conversation with the police department and saying, we really respect the role that you play, and it's so important, what you do for public safety and the risks that you all take every day. And we're planning these events, and these are some of the concerns that have come up. Like, try to have a human to human, lobby those folks so that they can get, that much more, in their brain. So that's one thing for the in-person organizing. And then I think there's just so many creative things that people are doing to try to organize people from afar, but I'm not the expert on that. So sorry, that's what I can give you.
Well, thank you, Angela. And somebody, that 50 things that white people can do, we'll circulate that after this. Several people have asked for that. And Narissa, thank you for that comment. And Angela, I just want to thank you so much for doing this. And everybody that can stay on, please stay on, because Angela will be able to answer other questions that we have not been able to get to. But we truly appreciate your insights on, these are tough issues, and structure is tough, but we got to address them, and we're seeing it every day. Any final thoughts before some people have to leave? Just in terms
of, there's one thing I want to say, which is the systemic answer, solutions are all structural. But I also want you to be really clear about the interpersonal solutions too. So in that 50 things that white people can do document, buried in there is something that basically says, if you are a white person, or even if you're someone like me, who's a light-skinned person of color who gets a lot of skin color privilege, even though I'm a person of color, how do you pay attention to the people of color in your life and listen to them? And I'm going to get really personal now. I've had some very difficult conversations in the last week with friends who cannot acknowledge or make space for what I experience as a person of color in the world. And so it is really painful to have to cut off people that you thought were your friends because you find out that their values are, and it's not that they're bad people, it's that they do not have the skill set and they have not done the work, and they are literally dangerous to me. So yes, work on the structural, and yes, focus on the things that are most immediate. Both those things are true.
Thank you so much. Words of wisdom. Stay on, everybody. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Anne. And I'm really sorry that the things you have to deal with, Angela, every day. And we're going to, I am still hopeful that we are going to make progress. We're seeing a really dark time. And I hope that we can all make progress. When you think of the people on this call, they all care about these issues and are working on these issues. So Anne, why don't you wrap up and then we'll go back to Angela.
Thank you. We just have a few more announcements, especially for folks that are new to our network at NAAEE. Want to remind you that we do have a ton of webinars coming up, and webinars archived on our website on EE Pro. You can check out all of the previous recordings. We share notes, we share resources, so check it out on our website. We have two wonderful webinars lined up in June. Next week, June 3rd, we will be hearing from our 30 under 30 alumni, Sean Russell, Kimmy Wade, and Dyson Chi. They're going to be talking about how to bridge formal and non-formal EE in the civic action space. So that's going to be really great. June 3rd at 3 o'clock. Also in June, Kristen Grimm is going to join us again for part 2 of strategic communications later this month. We're going to be sharing more information about that very soon. Additionally, we do have a growing list of resources for the field during this time. You can check it out. It's all on our website. It's titled Online Learning Tools and Resources During These Difficult Times. If you have any ideas of what you want to see on that, you can send them to me and we'll share your ideas right there. And that is all. So we're just going to take the next few minutes with Angela to take the rest of your questions. So if you want to stay for after school time, please join us, please stay, and you can add your questions to the chat box.
And Angela, are you ready for your first one? Thank you, Anne.
Sure.
I also want to just name one thing based on what I'm seeing in the chat, is I think there's a lot of expertise in this group who could collectively answer the question, what does structural racism and structural classism look like in environmental education? And I would really encourage you all to write something, to articulate what that is, because structural inequality is very opaque to many people. And it would be a huge contribution to the environmental education field for you all to be able to articulate, this thing that we're talking about that a lot of people are like, what the heck is that? For you to be able to drill down and at a level of specificity, articulate and communicate and educate folks about what structural classism and racism looks like in environmental education, I think that would be hugely valuable.
Great idea. I missed the name, and Anne, you might have caught it, but somebody asked about how do we deal with the generational trauma that is going to be happening as a result of this virus. Have you thought much about that and how it relates especially to equity issues?
So there is such an important need to create spaces in historically white institutions and movements for people with subordinated groups who really need the space to heal. I'm going to give you an example. Obviously, you have to do some sort of education and learning in order to create a foundation for any organization to do equity work. People come with very different lived experiences, completely different notions about what this work is. So you have to do, some workshops and sessions and get people on the same page and try to bring them up to a level of shared understanding about this work in order to be able to even do it. And even, to decide kind of what language you want to use to frame this work, not to mention this rationale that I think is essential. What happens in historically white institutions that have very white cultures, white supremacist cultures, is you do this education and learning and you subject people of color to more trauma. So it's mandatory because everybody has to go, but people of color end up having to hear really off questions. And as white people are learning, for example, about race, people of color are subjected to all of that. And it can actually be traumatizing to actually, be forced to go to a mandatory workshop. So the thing that's been coming up in a lot of organizations that I work with, and I've written some of these policies, is, how do we provide spaces for people with subordinated group identities to be able to have their own space and community, a place where they feel safer, a place where they can talk about things that only they experience. So whether it's an affinity group for queer staff or affinity group for, people of color broadly, or, an Asian Pacific Islander, group in the organization, part of the problem is there isn't enough space in an organization, and it doesn't get resourced to actually grapple with trauma and with what we experience. And most people with subordinated group identities who are swimming in an institution that is very much grounded in dominant culture, they're constantly having to adjust and fit in and assimilate and suck it up and let that comment go and not worry about that because you can only fight so many battles. Like, that accumulates. So it's just incredibly important to make that space. And here's the resource thing, because I know, based on everything else we've talked about, if you don't prioritize that, I can tell you exactly what the impact is. If you don't prioritize making space for people with subordinated group identities, you are actually making it harder for them to exist in the institution. And the other thing I would just name is, in addition to the fact that people of color or queer people or, poor people are always having to educate the dominant group, the other thing that happens, especially for people of color, is there's no space to work out our own shit. Do you think all Black and Latino and Asian Pacific Islander and Indigenous and multiracial people get along perfectly? No, they don't. Is there a history behind, how we've had so many challenges as communities? Do we ever get the space to work that out? No, we don't. So to me, this is about what you prioritize and why it's so incredibly important to make this a priority. And it's not for the, to be nice. It's because there are actual negative impacts that will bite you in the butt if you do not, make these investments. Those are a couple thoughts.
That's great. Anne, do you have one ready?
I just want to call out a comment from Sasha. And Sasha says that it's been an issue of not having enough professional representation for younger people of color, whether that's through different religions or classes that can help inspire and empower them to take interest or follow the path of environmental education work. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have been for many years cooking up a plan to have leaders in the environmental field, people of color, women, gender nonconforming people, people who identify as queer, people who come from, certain backgrounds that aren't always encouraged or kind of structurally nudged into environmental careers, and giving at a movement level resources for those leaders to engage the next generation. Because here's what's happening right now in the environmental field. You've got a bunch of white leaders running around chasing kids of color. Hey, come over, Red Rover, come, and it's like, is that exactly the right messenger for that engagement? And so there are so many extraordinary people of color and queer leaders and people who grew up very poor, who are absolute, environmental leaders who could be on the forefront of engaging the next generation. And we need to resource that. So I'm actually chatting with a foundation about trying to, nudge some of that, because it really needs to be movement wide. Because every little nonprofit can't do all that level of recruitment. So it needs to be something a little bit broader and across our sector.
I love that. Joan Haley just asked the question about having white people get together to talk about what they can do, and is that create an exclusive or kind of, separating out white people from people of color, or is that a good thing so that you're not always having to have people of color, explain what you're doing wrong or what you should be doing or what you can be doing?
It is absolutely a good thing. And it's true not only for white people, it's true for all of us who have dominant group identities. I can't tell you the last time I got together with a bunch of heterosexuals to talk about how our heterosexuality shows up and how in unintentional ways we oppress people. Mm-hmm. who identify as queer, as lesbian, bisexual, you know, like if you don't do your own work, you inflict your work on other people in broader spaces. And so here's the thing, you need to be very clear about your rationale for why these separate learning spaces are important. You need to communicate it. You have to do some foundational education and learning so people understand why group identity is such an important thing. And people have to understand the power dynamic that there is a dominant group and a subordinated group. Because if you just say, hey, we're having a white group over the learning group over there, and yay, people of color group over there, people are going to go, ah, because everything in the United States has taught us that naming group identity explicitly is somehow offensive. And also that, you know, but that's segregation, you know, so there are appropriate times and spaces for people to be in different, you know, group settings, but you have to be really articulate about the why, and you have to, you know, bring people along with that basic education about power dynamics and group identity, or else they will wig out. In my experience.
Anne, do you want to ask the last one? We have some great ones here.
We have a question from Danielle. She's starting a discussion group next week about equity. Good luck, Danielle. That's wonderful. And the conversation is supposed to center around how it shows up in their work. She says she's not an expert. So do you have any suggestions on facilitation techniques, or how can she facilitate this difficult conversation? Should she even facilitate, or just let it happen naturally?
You should absolutely facilitate. You absolutely should not let it happen naturally. Because unless you 100% trust the equity skill sets of the people participating, it can be a total hot mess very quickly. So a couple of suggestions. Oh dear, my computer is starting to overheat. So I'm gonna have to make this quick, but hopefully it won't shut down in 3 minutes. But we're having heat wave in Vermont, no air conditioning. So here, the first thing is, be really planful. Make sure you have working agreements. Make sure that you have a plan for how you're going to manage if stuff goes sideways. You know, be really explicit about what those working agreements are and why they matter. Make sure you have a real plan and an agenda. I think some of that agenda can be anything that comes up, but make sure that you have a rhyme and a reason for how you're framing the session. It's very helpful in the beginning to have some real intros so people really and truly get to know each other. I think the most important thing I would say is it might be helpful to you to pick a topic so that it doesn't go completely all over the place. And your question is very challenging because you're not asking what's important to you out in the world on equity. You're saying, what do we do in this organization, which is why the ground rules are so important around, you know, this is about knowledge and sharing what we've observed. This is, you know, how you don't hold things against people, you know, so there are a whole bunch of things related to just really thinking it through, including what you're going to do if things go sideways, and thinking through the layers of sideways and the different kinds of sideways. The more you do that thinking, the better prepared you'll be and more confident you'll feel. And, you know, if you think like it's a really touchy group and it's too specific, a kind of close topic, you might want to, you know, broaden it a little bit in order to make it not quite so risky.
Angela, thank you so much. There are so many other questions. Somebody mentioned the group showing up for racial justice as a group that people might want to explore. Somebody else mentioned how, and you know this issue with us, low pay in this field, so it's automatically excluding some audiences to even join our field or feel welcome in this field, and unpaid internships and all of that. So there's so much chatter in the chat box. And it's really so helpful to have you, Angela, helping us think through these really, really difficult issues. And Anne, thank you so much. Everybody will get a copy of the recording, the chat, the slides, and lots of great resources and ideas and suggestions in the chat box from all of you. You were right, Angela. They have a lot of expertise. But Angela, big virtual clapping. Oh, I can clap and you can hear it. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And Anne, thank you. Take care,
so
everybody.
Much for doing this. And thanks everyone for everything that you do. I know it's really hard but really meaningful work.
Thank you, Angela. Take care, stay safe, cool off. Bye.